In February 2024, French President Emmanuel Macron issued a statement that shocked the world. After a meeting in Paris of over 20 European heads of state and other Western officials, Macron issued a stark warning to Vladimir Putin. "We will do everything needed so Russia cannot win the war." If that wasn't incendiary enough, in his next breath, the French leader openly discussed the possibility of deploying Western troops to fight in Ukraine. There's no consensus today to send in an official, endorsed manner troops on the ground, but in terms of dynamics, nothing can be ruled out. Putin's response was predictably furious. According to Al Jazeera, the Russian leader had this to say on the matter. The West has announced the possibility of sending Western military contingents to Ukraine. The consequences for possible interventionists will be way more tragic. Not for the first time in the last 2 years, the rest of the world has been left facing the very real possibility of a wider conflict that may have a nuclear conclusion. But what led us to this critical stage? If you were to take a step back and soberly assess the situation, it's easy to see why Putin was so riled by Macron's not-so-thinly veiled threats. After all, one of the main historical bones of contention for Moscow was NATO expansion into Central and Eastern Europe, most notably the establishment of a fully operational military base on Polish soil. Having been subjected to countless invasions and occupations throughout its colorful history, from Genghis Khan to Napoleon Bonaparte, Russia saw this as an act of aggression and a threat to its sovereignty. To put another great military-shaped fly into the ointment, 20,000 troops from 9 countries have recently participated in full-blown North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, exercises in Central or Eastern Europe. Where, exactly? You guessed it, northern Poland. Taking all of the above into account, how close are we to a Western troop deployment in the war in Ukraine? And would that inevitably lead to a global conflict, maybe even of World War III proportions? That's the question that we'll attempt to answer in this video. Before we begin, we must acknowledge that the mere presence of a relatively large number of US, French, and British troops in Poland could easily be interpreted as a hugely provocative act by Russia in itself. Granted, Western leaders have attempted to put a far more benign spin on the situation. Terms like testing the NATO alliance's deterrence and defense capabilities have been bandied around in the press. But because Macron has made such pointed statements of potential intent, it can easily be seen by some as adding kerosene to an already blazing fire. But what exactly were the troops doing there? Well, according to an in-depth report from Defense News, nothing more than standard military drills. Following deployment, the participating nations undertook many maneuvers, both on land and amphibious, the likes of which are seen in any training exercises conducted by any army in any part of the world. Tellingly, however, these drills included a challenging river crossing. As part of the Polish-led Dragon 24 military exercise, American, British, French, German, Spanish, Turkish, Slovenian, and Lithuanian soldiers traveled across a 320-meter section of the Vistula River. They chose this time of year to host this event, said Major General Cezary Wisniewski, a senior Polish military official, as the waterway can be difficult to navigate in early March. "We wanted the most challenging conditions. The water levels of the river are very high and the winds are usually strong." The crossing involved positioning floating bridges, which then had to be loaded with tanks to navigate from the opposite side of the bank and dock safely for the vehicles to disembark and continue with their military objectives. Furthermore, a simulated crisis included the movement of many personnel and combat vehicles across Polish territory. "The movement of troops is a crucial part of the exercise," said Wisniewski, "especially in a situation like today where we have large formations of troops involved, with 20,000 plus military personnel and 3,500 pieces of equipment." At this point, you would be forgiven for questioning the sheer numbers involved here, over 20,000 troops and 3,500 pieces of military hardware. More statement of intent than a standard military drill. Even the least cynical amongst you must find it hard not to class such a large-scale exercise as an act of intimidation. To others, it closely resembles a warm-up before the deployment of military personnel from NATO countries to Ukrainian territory, even if they wouldn't, at this stage, be taking an active role in combat operations. All of this was corroborated in a recent statement by the Polish Ministry of Defense. While the exercises are defensive and not directed against any state, they are deemed to be a demonstration of the ability to counter any aggressive policies and proactive activities of the Russian Federation. Another broadside in Moscow's direction, if ever there was one. But perhaps there is a deeper underlying symbolism involved here, one that goes further than the military exercises on Polish soil, for these drills took place only around 100 kilometers away from Poland's border with the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea. And again, that is something that would be a huge cause of concern for a Moscow almost obsessively paranoid about any potential incursions into its territories. Now, this area, the Suwalki Gap, or Suwalki Corridor as it's sometimes referred to, has been of great historical importance for many years. Moreover, it acts as a choke point that could well play an incredibly vital role if Putin decides to escalate his military aims in Eastern and Central Europe. But where exactly is the Suwalki Gap, and why is it so important? The Suwalki Gap is an area around the border between Lithuania and Poland that's sparsely populated, to say the least. It represents the shortest path between Belarus and the aforementioned Russian exclave of Kaliningrad Oblast on the Polish side of the border. Named after the Polish town of Suwalki, this choke point has been of great strategic and military significance ever since Poland and the Baltic states joined NATO. The border between Poland and Lithuania was formed after the Suwalki Agreement of 1920, but it was of little importance in the interwar period, 1918 to 39. At the time, the Polish lands stretched farther northeast. During the Cold War, however, Lithuania was part of the Soviet Union, and Communist Poland was a member of the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact alliance. The eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact hardened borders that cut through the shortest land route between Kaliningrad, Russian territory isolated from the mainland, and Belarus, Russia's ally. From that geographical information alone, it's clear to see why the Suwalki Gap is seen as such a key location should the war take an unexpected turn. In fact, an article from Politico shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine went a step further, claiming that the area is the most dangerous place on Earth. Why? Well, Western military planners warn that the Suwalki Gap would likely be one of the Russian president's first targets, were he ever to choose to ramp up the war in Ukraine into a confrontation to end all confrontations with NATO. At present, all is quiet in the area, but for how long though? Ramunas Sepatuskas, commander of a local company of Lithuania's Riflemen's Union, a voluntary militia with roots stretching back more than a century, is monitoring the situation in the border region with growing unease and concern. For many, the Suwalki Gap is Lithuania's Achilles heel. Some think there's no point in attacking us, but it must be noted that this is a direct route to Kaliningrad, he said. If they're able to overcome Ukraine, it's possible that the next blow would fall here. And therein lies the rub, and perhaps a little more light on Macron's statements, as well as just why US, French, and British troops might just be ready to enter the fray in Ukraine. In February, Russia scored one of, if not the, biggest victories of the increasingly attritional conflict so far, the taking of the hugely important strategic Donbas city of Avdiivka. The fact that fighting, whether intermittent or heavy, has been raging since 2014 only underscores the significance of the win for Moscow. Even more worryingly, Ukrainian troops are running out of everything from effective radar equipment and military hardware to basic ammunition on the ground. But a restock of supplies is slow in coming, across the board. In an interview with CBS and published by The Hill in March 2024, the beleaguered Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made the following statement: "We don't have rounds, artillery rounds. We don't know what will be tomorrow. That's why we have to prepare." Since the beginning of the conflict, Ukraine has received unprecedented levels of military aid. According to the Council on Foreign Relations from February 2024, the US alone has pledged over $75 billion so far. Naturally, at the start of the conflict, the political goodwill was there for all to see. Citizens in Western nations in particular were appalled at Putin's act of aggression and fully backed their government's actions. Now, over 2 years down the line, people have become increasingly war-weary, especially now they are being bombarded with images of Israel's brutal war with Hamas. And this has had an inevitable knock-on effect. Back in December 23, US President Joe Biden encountered incredible difficulties in getting approval for a new military aid package for Ukraine passed through Congress. In a report from the BBC, there was huge resistance from Senate Republicans to the new $61 billion package, despite an unnamed Ukrainian official stating that failure to secure more US aid would mean a very high possibility that the war would be lost to Russia. Of course, this is the outcome no one in the West wants to see, evidenced by Macron's comments quoted at the top of the video, but the plain facts of the conflict cannot be disputed. Ukraine has received huge military backing from the West, but it now looks as if the country is slowly but surely losing the war. So is the solution yet more funding, the transport of more military hardware, bigger and better rockets and guns, more support on the ground, and more economic sanctions against Russia? In an ideal world, perhaps that would be the easiest solution, all of the above. But no war can go on in perpetuity, just as no government, no matter how well-meaning or righteous the cause they champion, has unlimited coffers. Hence, Ukraine's main allies find themselves in an invidious position where direct action might be the only way to proceed. a point emphasized by Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. The issue of sending European forces to help Ukraine was never one to be dismissed, he said. Europe is now faced with a terrible dilemma, watching Ukraine potentially run out of ammunition or stepping in and helping Ukraine more directly. Zelensky has hinted as much himself, warning that the war could escalate to Europe. The US is helping Ukraine and we are grateful for their support, but the United States don't have the war going on. But it can come to Europe and to the United States of America. It can come very quickly to Europe. But are the leaders of countries like the US, France, and Britain really ready to act? Do they genuinely fear that a Russian victory in Ukraine may be only the start of a wider conflict in Europe and beyond? And were the drills that took place in Poland back in March actually preparations for a special military operation of their own? If so, it brings us all the way back to the Suwalki Gap. As stated, it's the only way to get by road or rail from Poland and Central Europe to the Baltic states, which are arguably NATO's most exposed members. A Russian move to seize control of the corridor may seem beyond the realm of possibility at the present time, as it would explicitly involve an attack on NATO territory, automatically triggering a US military response. Why? Article 5 of the NATO Charter. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. But will Putin be cowed by Article 5 in the way much of the world assumes? Will it continue to act as a deterrent when the stakes are so much higher now? That's a question that can't be answered at this stage, but considering the Russian leader's complete disregard for international law, it would pay for the West to prepare now for the worst-case scenarios. However, the sticking point seems to be the very real concerns that increased military assistance to Ukraine, meaning direct troop deployment of the kind Macron threatened in Paris back in February, might paint the West as co-combatants in the eyes of the international law Putin himself is so happy to flout. And there's no way that any Western government, be it Biden, Macron, or UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, could risk being cast as the aggressors. History would never forgive them. If they did proceed regardless, it might give Putin the excuse he needs, and probably wants, for lashing out and launching new military offensives of his own. Namely, the Kremlin may see an increased threat to Kaliningrad and seize the Suwalki corridor to create a land bridge to the exclave. Moreover, Kaliningrad is now home to substantial Russian combat forces, including the Russian Baltic Fleet, advanced air defenses, and mobile nuclear-capable Iskander-M missiles. For that reason, Russia is hugely sensitive to any threats, real or imagined or invented, to its control of the non-contiguous territory, and might risk escalation if it misinterpreted NATO's actions near Kaliningrad. Naturally, any attempt by Putin to seize the corridor would mean an attack on Lithuania or Poland, or both, and a direct war between NATO and Russia. And like we said, this would at best be strategically unwise and at worst a precursor to World War III. But time and time again, Putin has kept the West second-guessing. There's nothing to suggest that a potential conflict over the Suwalki Gap would be any different. For now, the world can only look on with bated breath. Make no mistake though, the clock is ticking. And perhaps the country looking most concernedly at the hands traversing that metaphorical clock face is, of course, Poland. In the 20th century, the Polish people suffered terribly at the hands of two of history's most brutal dictators. In one direction, they had Hitler's all-conquering Wehrmacht, in the other, Stalin's vengeful Red Army. One intent on invading and seizing power, the other to rape, pillage, and forcibly indoctrinate the populace with their communist ideology. Put quite simply, the country became one big battlefield, with its major towns and cities being reduced to nothing more than rubble in the process. Understandably, Warsaw never wanted to be in that position again. To protect itself going into the 21st century and beyond, Poland has built one of the most modern and best-equipped armies, not just in Europe, but the whole world. Indeed, the defense minister Mariusz Błaszczak claimed that his country would soon have the most powerful land forces in Europe. Many would argue that the country already has. At the time of the making of this video, Poland has more tanks and howitzers than Germany and is on course to have a much larger army with a target of 300,000 troops by 2035, compared with Germany's current 170,000. In terms of troop numbers, the military is about 150,000 strong, with 30,000 belonging to a new territorial defense force set up in 2017. These consist of weekend soldiers who undergo 16 days of training, followed up by refresher courses. Initially sneered at, Ukraine's success in using mobile militia equipped with anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles now makes the idea seem much more sensible. The list could go on, and it's made Poland a powerful force to be reckoned with on the global stage. To the extent that a senior US Army official sees the country playing a crucial role in supporting Ukraine and in shoring up NATO defenses in the Baltics, Poland has become our most important partner in continental Europe. So, would Putin be willing to open up another military front and launch an all-out attack on a country with such fearsome military resources at its disposal and such powerful allies? The ramifications have already been set out in this video if the ultimate answer is none the clearer. To come full circle, Macron's threats of Western troop deployment were roundly criticized by the rest of the world. For some, they were unnecessarily aggressive. For others, reckless and ill-advised. Already, the situation in Ukraine is on a knife edge and tightrope combined. With Putin seemingly happy to play the long game now, what will ultimately happen in the short to medium term is difficult to predict. In recent interviews, Zelensky has said that he fully expects the Russians to launch another full-blown offensive in the spring, with May being the most likely date. Meanwhile, predictions coming out of Moscow, both from those opposed and those firmly behind Putin's leadership, suggest that the war could drag on for another 5 to 7 years. But maybe the key factor in both the short and longer term will be the outcome of the US presidential election in November 2024. If Donald Trump were to be re-elected, it could have disastrous ramifications for Kyiv. Whether that would mean a significant reduction in military aid or the end of all financial and military support altogether is yet to be seen. Back in 2023, when asked about the Ukraine conflict, Trump was in a conciliatory mood. "I know Zelensky very well, and I know Putin very well. I would tell Zelensky no more. You've got to make a deal. I would tell Putin, if you don't make a deal, we're going to give him, Zelensky, a lot." Since then, the former president's tone has changed. Worryingly, in a CNN report from March 24, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is quoted as saying in an interview with M1 broadcast, he, Trump, has a very clear vision. He says the following: first, he will not give a single penny for the Russo-Ukrainian war. That's why the war will end, because it's obvious that Ukraine cannot stand on its own 2 feet. If that transpires, then the whole nature of the war will, of course, be turned on its head. So perhaps the biggest question facing the likes of the US, France and Britain is just when exactly the time for procrastinating is over. To their credit, the governments of each of those countries took decisive action from the outset. They pledged huge amounts of money to bolster the Ukrainian war effort and implemented some of the harshest economic sanctions against Russia ever seen. But still, it hasn't been enough, not by a long shot. In addition to the significant military breakthroughs referenced earlier in the video, Putin has also managed to absorb the economic blows associated with the sanctions by exporting huge amounts of gas and oil to Asia, most notably to China and India, if at a drastically reduced price. In addition, military expansion in the prized Arctic region has carved a lucrative new trade route that could prove decisive in years to come. Economically, Russia looks more than capable of funding the war for as long as necessary. In fact, some business experts are of the opinion that the Russian economy is so reliant upon the war now that Moscow simply can't afford to pull out of Ukraine for the foreseeable future. Perhaps even more worryingly are rumors that Russia has been holding back some of its more advanced modern military capabilities. In a report from Reuters from February of this year, Putin claimed that 95% of Russia's strategic nuclear forces had been modernized and that the Air Force has just taken delivery of 4 new supersonic nuclear-capable bombers. If that's true, it only adds to Zelensky's woes and puts even more pressure on his allies. With a significant number of US, French and British troops assembling close to the theater of war, and Moscow looking to make another decisive move on the geopolitical chessboard, the future couldn't be more uncertain. Whether an increasingly unlikely diplomatic solution can be found, or whether a change in the White House will force every nation's hand, is yet to be seen. But if Macron's words are anything to go by, Western troops could well be mobilized and ready to enter Ukraine sooner than anybody could ever have imagined or feared. Now we're coming to the end of the video, it's time to ask you what you think about the potential Western troop deployment in Ukraine. Was February's statement of intent no more than an empty threat from Macron to see exactly how Putin would react? Or do you think the conflict, now in its 3rd calendar year, has reached a stage where Western intervention is all but inevitable? After all, the military aid packages from NATO countries in particular are unsustainable in the long term, and with Putin's recent landslide re-election and some Russian political experts predicting a much longer war than anticipated, the time for the West to act may well be upon us. If not, Russian aggression could see the country take decisive steps into Central and maybe even Western Europe. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Poland would destroy Russia in a war, or click this other video instead.